Going live. You're live. Okay, so I'm going to try and do a different type of thumbnail. Okay, yeah, that's okay. Not too much glare. Okay, I should be able to get a screenshot from that and redo the thumbnail before too many people watch and complain that the thumbnail has nothing to do with the books. But the usual method I have of taking photos and all that is a bit tedious and time consuming, and fix it in post. It's today's motto. When I do the other uploads, I can select a thumbnail from those images, and that's why I've had a bunch of the music ones that have no lettering and such over them. But when I do a live video, I can't do that. I have to do a whole different process. Okay, that's not interesting to anyone, I know. And it's been a minute and I'm babbling. But I was going to do another travel video about the books and pamphlets and maps and things, and there's been no outcry of overt interest for such a video, so I'm going to do this one instead because I just finished both of these books finally. It took me a little longer to read than I necessarily would have liked, because of course I was interrupted with not just travel videos but the actual travel and some other things. And I'm always a little guarded about how much I can, read or disclose, even though it's a pretty common book. Most people have heard of this one, maybe even more than this one. The thing I was really going to say, but wait, sorry, before I get ahead of myself, because there will be more or less a part 1 and a part 2, at least. There's 2 books. So delving into the shorter one first, even though I started reading it after I was already pretty far into the big, thick one. So this one is about like 200 pages, and this one was over 700 pages. Both of them were actually kind of page turners in their own way. Neither was a terrible slog. So once I got into this one a little bit, then when I went back to that one, I had to kind of remember where I was. And then after that, it kind of evened out, where when I'd get kind of sick of that one, then it would be easier to go to this one. And then all of a sudden I realized I was almost done with this one. So I went back to that one and forced myself to do a pretty big chunk of that one, and ended up finishing, because I had read half of this and stopped. And then when I got a decent part into that, then I read like 50 pages of this and then stopped a little bit, but shorter, and finally knocked it out. The main takeaway, well, 2 main takeaways. The first being the one related to the title of the video. And I was questioning this separately regarding interior design decor videos that I had been seeing lately, where they're still talking about dark academia, but online as a trend in terms of fashion and other things I had not really been seeing as much. So I was kind of wondering if dark academia is pretty much over in its old hat now. But of course, back to school is right around the corner. We're literally less than a week away from September. Many younger students, at least, are already back in school. I don't know about all the universities, but schools go back before Labor Day now, which is still a mystery to me, at least being in a warm climate where it's it was 100 degrees yesterday or something. So I'm glad I wasn't in a classroom, even if I was reading, or not this one, finishing this one finally. Well, mostly finished it today. Didn't really actually read yesterday. But the other takeaway, aside from the academic, is that neither of these books I would necessarily classify as actual academia. This one, again, spoiler, starts off in a college setting, but it isn't about college. And this one has basically nothing to do with college and formal education per se, although there is a long section right around where I stopped reading for a while, where the character gets super into fashion and collecting rare fabrics and that sort of thing. I don't do heavy spoilers, but if you watched a bunch of Bernadette Banner stuff kind of recently, is right up that alley. Like I said, but I can't not do any spoilers and can't not talk about any of the text, because then like I'm just holding up a book, right? The other big takeaway though that I noticed that is kind of why it's famous in maybe a dark academia-ish connection is the one character who says all the cynical snide things, who Lord Henry, who is often one of the same as the Eat, Pray, Love woman that I mentioned. It's often quoted as Oscar Wilde and like memes and bumper sticker kind of content things, t-shirt sayings and whatnot. Even though it's actually a character saying the things. So how much of it we should really call, I mean, obviously Wilde originated the words, or he heard somebody say something similar and thought that was clever and stole it for, his personal use, and then, made more like that, kind of like the Downton Abbey woman, the Dowager. She's kind of the same way, like, but in a different, well, they're both lazy aristocracy, wealthy, but she's not overtly, malicious, I guess, in tone, even though she can be my way or the highway kind of personality as well. The actual story, of course, well, the Cliff Notes, right? It's, there's not exactly a murder mystery. A lot of the really bad stuff happens off screen, kind of the same as a Greek tragedy. So you're not subjected overtly to all of the sin and vice and violence, but some of it's there. So it's definitely not a G-rated book, and it's not issued as required reading in any high school classes that I know of. So I think that's part of why it kind of gets discovered in a more dark academia setting or a period in somebody's life. The fact that I'm reading it kind of late, I guess, even though I had heard of it years ago and just kind of had no, particular overt interest in, the Victorian era age or any of that, or aristocracy in general, or, whatever the content I thought it was about. And I think I had seen probably some TV movie of, part of it, and had some warped memory from there. I don't recall exactly, because the ending was slightly different than I had remembered or thought I remembered or whatever, or had assumed. There is some, this edition has some bits where it references poems and things. And it's kind of odd reading snippets of these poems and things too, realizing, how many poets that we kind of ascribe maybe a sentimental quality to or something, and then you read the actual words and it's kind of like, oh, they're actually kind of depressing, I guess. Or not thinking about what I thought they were going to be thinking about. So again, not exactly academic literally, but definitely related to academia in the sense of when else are you really reading romantic poetry and such, other than college required reading courses and that sort of thing these days. I don't know, again, how much Byron and Shelley and Keats and all that is in any 10th grade English class, maybe a smidge. So yeah, you're kind of having to seek more of that kind of thing out. And then, like I said, all this stuff about jeweled, bedazzled, or whatever garments and things like that whole segment actually kind of interested me, because again, I had been watching videos about that sort of stuff more recently. If you had presented that to me, 10, 20 years ago, I probably would have thought that whole segment was even more of a slog than, maybe your average, I don't know, YouTube viewer or whatever. Yeah, I mean, obviously the moral question of the thing and the art version of the thing and the thing, like, I don't know that it would necessarily be something that would be this video. I might want to do a separate video on, the meaning of the art or whatever, and the artist himself as a character and this and that. And that character is kind of cast aside almost as soon as he's introduced anyway, really. I thought when I first started the book that he would be the actual main character and that Dorian Gray and Lord Harry or whatever, they were going to be the ancillary characters. I didn't realize that Dorian Gray was actually the main character. Spoiler alert again. Yeah, well, I mean, you figure that out by the second or third chapter or whatever, but I'm just saying the way it was introduced. And it would have been a different book entirely if it had been all speculative narration from the mind of the painter himself. Instead, we're given a third-person omniscient or whatever. So who the actual narrator is just whoever. But the narrator does have their own voice, kind of, in a couple spots, where it is kind of odd, where you do wonder who it could be. It could be the original butler. That could be or it could be, a dead character even because a couple characters do at least 3 die. So any of them, well, one of them being more of a Forrest Gump kind of guy, he wouldn't be a very likely candidate, but still, maybe Forrest grew a brain after he died and now all of a sudden he's almost eloquent, who knows. Kind of a loose end tied up in an odd way toward the end, a little bit of a surprise twist here and there, a couple things where it's written in kind of that older style language, so it's not, Shakespeare where you need somebody to explain the whole thing to you, but it is definitely that kind of way of talking that they had of kind of talking around the subject, so you have to kind of wade through, figure out okay, he's not joking here. Some of it is the issue of the dialogue, like who said what. It's not as terrible as it could be, but in a couple spots. And then they introduce a bunch of characters who only show up for like one scene. So I'm wondering if that person's significant or not. Chances, most of them are not. It doesn't matter. They're just there. In the end, most of them are just there. It's kind of shorter than it should be, actually, in a way. If you were really going to flesh out those characters and those relationships. And because there's a big spoiler, there's a big gap from like when he's about age 25 to when he's in his later 30s. Where, yeah, maybe the book would be more boring and he wants to get to the ending or for whatever reason. A lot of those relationships, I felt like that was like, really? We're skipping that many years? Like in the in the space of like 2 sentences? Okay, sure. But, other than that, it was, wasn't like too hard to follow along the story in terms of like dense literature. Again, it was mostly a page turner. If you asked me to like quote a bunch of stuff from it right now, I'd be like, no, but I didn't memorize it, but I got the overall gist pretty well enough. So like I said, yeah, if you want to, there's some other stuff at the end here that I didn't read yet. There's some references to opera, a lot of references to drama. So tie in there a little bit, but it's mostly superficial. So again, not terribly academic. They don't analyze Shakespeare in depth as much as they just reference it constantly for a couple chapters. And then once again, that falls by the wayside and gets replaced with other interests. more along the lines of each interest is maybe a step down the ladder of moral degradation or whatever. Like, okay, this costs money, but it's superficial more than the opera and the theater house, right? I mean, you could kind of view it that way. Like these beautiful silk tapestries and beaded garments and things require a lot of effort, and they may contain symbolism and such, but we're not really interested in what they mean. We're just interested in how they look, right? For the most part. And then we go down again to, the public houses and the other, vices of the day and that kind of thing, and the relationships with the people. Some of the people, again, on a sliding scale of aristocracy, how many aristocracy, or aristocrats are actually kind of low value humans versus how many of them, might be higher. But we're not really introduced to a lot of lower caste people who have a lot of like redeeming value or anything either. It's kind of investigated a little bit more at the beginning and then sort of abandoned also. But they have presumably less leeway to get away with things if they do bad things. Is kind of implied more than stated, but I feel smart saying it. Again, stuff that could have been investigated a little bit more in that kind of missing chunk. I think if this, it didn't even have to be that much longer. I think if it was like 30 more pages, people would still stick with it if there were well written pages and there was enough, oomph there. But like I said, since I was sandwiching it with a really long book, the fact that it went quickly helped, So there's that. Like I said, I'd like to say some of the quotes and add my own twist on them, but I'm just kind of reluctant to really do that. Sorry. I know if you feel cheated, but it is free entertainment, so like whatever. There was one quote where he says about a third-rate actress with a pretty face. That seems to be a lot of them still to be critical of Hollywood. For a brief moment, one of my takeaways that I can, since I'm not using this as a study guide in my other playlist about the how to write screenplays kind of content, how to write screenplays, how to write fiction. I haven't been keeping up with that. I haven't had a lot of viewers, but I do have several videos of that type of thing. More of it as same as this, kind of more conversational than being able to go totally deep dive, but not totally, without merit, I think, or I wouldn't have recorded it all. So yeah, here, gold embroidered caryatides, 15 feet high in his apartment, whatever. Embroidered in turquoises with verses from the Quran, all that kind of thing. But it's not super. I mean, this part's descriptive because we're talking about specific items, but he doesn't go overboard with, the air was dark, the night was gray. I'm quoting Allen Ginsberg unintentionally. But there are some parts, the lamplight struggled out through the fog, stuff like that. So it's just set a mood. Again, the dark academia parts of the book, but most of it isn't so much that. It's, it's brief scenes of dinners and meetings for tea and just typical English daily life for the idle class, whatever. So again, not a college, not an art school, not all of that kind of thing. And a lot of introspection in a sense. So again, kind of that moody academia thing, but not necessarily as brooding for the sake of brooding, I guess. I don't know how to make that distinction, I guess, per se, but if anybody disagrees with me, they'll let me know, I'm sure. And yeah, not quite a love story. Again, those kind of relationships almost developed and then kind of go nowhere. The ending, not totally shocking, but not again, not exactly what I thought or recalled. So I guess I'll just leave it there. And you know, if anybody wants to grill me about it, we can always discuss it further in the comments. So on to part 2, because I've been talking for 20 minutes, which is kind of long to talk about a book without really talking about all the aspects of the book that I would ordinarily, be expected to talk about. So this one, a little bit, in a sense, more class struggle, I guess. Not the exact same topic, but not that dissimilar, but a different century. So we're starting off in the 20s and working through the Depression, and the book comes out after the Second World War, but had been started before the war. So I'm not sure. I didn't do any real research on how long it took to write and, whether any of it was significantly changed. Actually, this says 1943, my fault. During the war, then. It doesn't really make any overt. There's some historical references, but it's definitely not trying to be a history book. I thought that was 1948, but I guess 1943. Okay. My fault for whatever. So it does briefly compare communism to fascism, but basically saying they both kind of achieve the same end result. Spoiler alert. The thing that was odd for me, okay, the first like 500 pages or so, it was pretty easy to suspend my disbelief and just kind of go with it. I had always, as a painter, this is an aside, thought as I got older, I wished I had really studied architecture and anatomy. And so I'd be able to understand that a lot better when I'm trying to paint buildings and stuff. Even though I have a photographic reference, a lot of things will be in shadow, and I want to understand exactly what I'm seeing. And I feel like if I had learned more about architecture, I would know what I'm painting when I'm just making a blob and hoping it reads, as opposed to not wanting to put in every single detail, because as a painter, you don't want to over detail your work typically, because that actually makes it like worse or less enjoyable, most of the time. You want to not always being an impressionist, but give an impression more than give a rendering, okay? And so a lot of the terminology and things I don't know about architecture. Again, I was following along. I got the gist. You can get as detailed as you want in the prose about that kind of thing, and it's almost the same thing as overworking a painting, right? But again, mostly a page turner. Some of that atmosphere stuff probably could have been cut out, but I'm not sure exactly how you could have made the book very much shorter. But again, it's like 3 books in one, right? Actually, it's divided into 4 sections, although I'm not sure that those are completely accurate divisions, because almost the whole last section isn't so much about that guy is this other guy, for half of it, and then it's back to that guy too, and all that kind of thing. And of course, the one character that you think is going to be the main character kind of takes a backseat, and I guess overall he is the main character, but this other character takes over for a long part, and so it's like, well, okay, and then this other character that doesn't show up, like he shows up in name, but he doesn't really show up until much later. Like he suddenly becomes the main character for almost a third of the book. Like I said, so it's kind of, I hate to say it, but she does violate a lot of the modern publication rules that YouTube videoers talk about. And there's one chapter, I wish I had marked the page exactly. If I find it on accident, I might be able to say it, but she starts a sentence with like, it was raining kind of thing. And it's like there's a way better way to phrase that, than it had been raining, it stopped. Like, what do you mean it? The sky, the rain, instead of, making a nicer sentence like the rain had stopped, then say the second part, So yeah, but that's a little bit nitpicky. But again, nowadays, if that was your opening header, any modern publisher would probably put a line through that, kind of thing. And again, there's, like I said, not a ton of it, but that was one of the things that really struck me. Like, oh, you'd be ridiculed as being an amateur right off the bat. She had written another book that I had read, and this one I had mentioned in a previous video, and they're not listed in this book. I have a different book that has the title. I don't remember the name of the one that I read a long time ago, and I remember I enjoyed it. I remember it was definitely not this thick. But the character, ready for the real spoilers. Again, like I said, the disbelief, I was able to forgive a fair amount just to get into the story. There was a long introduction, not super long, but she had written an introduction at some point in the 60s, I think, addressing people saying that, maybe would she have made some changes here and there. And I didn't finish reading all the study question stuff at the end yet. She was clarifying a bit. I'm not going to go all into it. And then she was saying, what would she change now for a more modern audience, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think some of it is naivete. I don't know how much of it is realistic. Like the way they present a court case of a guy representing himself is kind of cinematic, but I don't know that it would happen that way in real life. The character at first is kind of shown as being what we would probably term as autistic now. Very nonverbal, very kind of set in his ways, and at one point supposedly barely surviving, and then all of a sudden toward the end he gives like a 3-page speech, and it's like to the other guy, it's like all of a sudden, like now all of a sudden he talks to this dude that technically he barely knows, in a way, but they have this bond. All right, sure. Then there's this other character, and she explains it away a little bit more realistically, where he has a similar, like even longer 4 or 5-page monologue or something that is kind of there's 3 monologues, I guess, in the book that are kind of the crux of the whole thing. So if you were going to boil it down and, skip ahead and just wanted to get kind of the philosophy, you could just read those parts, start at page, I don't know, 600 or wherever 664 through 67, I think, and then you'd have to find the other 2. The one's almost at the very end. So it's really, 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 again, same character does 2 monologues, but the second monologue is kind of hinged on the first monologue. So us as readers, we already kind of know what he's talking about, whereas now he's presenting it to a jury and somehow they can figure out what he's talking about. Okay, sure. Unless he has a transcript of the previous 3 pages, I think they're going to be half lost about what he's actually saying. But the funny thing is they don't talk this much about the architecture in that kind of detail as they do as all of a sudden like capitalist philosophy and such. But then, like I said, so then all of a sudden autistic guy is who I thought was going to be the representative of communism, just in kind of the way he's working or whatever. He turns out to be the guy who's insisting he's the anti-communist. And this other character who has a similar monologue, but he unloads it on a character who is, again, at that, the one who you thought was going to be the main character, who's now basically irrelevant almost to the end of the story. And she kind of explains it away. Oh, well, I'm unloading on you because you'll listen, ha ha ha, kind of thing. And it's like, okay, well, because again, if he had presented this to the boss would have just told him to go home. I don't want to hear it. and he didn't want to reveal it all to the boss anyway for reasons and blah blah blah. And so okay. But so it's kind of a battle of wills between a bunch of characters, some of whom know each other better than others. They have their disagreements, they have their loyalties. Their loyalties kind of spring up at odd times, and it's all sort of, it's explained well enough. Their motivations after a certain sticking point where it was kind of like, huh. But like I said, after that point, when that got resolved, that's when the story for me got less realistic in a lot of ways, where I was just kind of like, okay, I'm finishing it for the point of finishing it now, not because it was bad, but because like I felt like not necessarily we were adding too much stuff that didn't need to be in it either. Because again, it was still mostly a page turner, but I think a modern editor who was a little bit more, I don't know, cutthroat than I am or whatever would definitely be able to say like, no, you don't need that, you don't need that, you don't need that, you don't need that. Whereas I was a little bit like, it's fine, whatever, it's taken a long time, but it's not unpleasant. The love story, if you want to call it that, that's going to be the sticking point for most modern audiences. Spoiler alert, you're really, really, really going to have a problem with part of that one. I even had kind of a problem with part of that one. Again, I don't know how much I can get to in detail here. It's not super graphic, but it's a lot more gritty, I guess, in overall in terms of what I thought you could get away with maybe in that era. Put it that way, considering what we hear about censorship in the 50s or whatever. This book definitely was way more groundbreaking than probably a lot of stuff that came out in the 60s. But like I said, I don't know who's going to exactly agree with all of it. I can kind of chuckle about it now. Well, I had a teacher a long time ago and was taking a class, and she was referencing a nonfiction book and said that the author had talked about this kind of behavior in his own personal life. And she said she put the book down and never even read it and didn't care what he had to say after that. Okay, well, if you're that kind of a reader, then I guess don't buy this book. Right? But again, that was, I thought kind of not necessarily immature or irresponsible, although as a teacher, I don't know why she would bring that up in that way, I guess, because if we're not going to discuss the book that you haven't read, then why are you even mentioning the book? I think I've mentioned this before, I'm not sure. And I'm intentionally not mentioning authors and names and things just because it's not totally relevant here. But yeah, if you have that much of a delicate sensibility that, you don't like to read anything that isn't PG or below, then, but the whole book is definitely not, smut or even, romantic per se. There's romantic elements, there's marriage, there's divorce. There's one relationship that I don't know if you're supposed to root for it or not. Again, I don't want to spoil it too much. It's kind of an odd moment that we're placing so much emphasis on this character at this time to just throw him away later. And so then we're introduced to this other character, and so there's kind of a connection, but it's not really a linchpin. The connection isn't really born of it, and it doesn't really matter. And the connection is supposedly allowed to happen organically, which would be completely unnecessary, especially in these social circles at that time. It would, again, suspension of disbelief. Wouldn't it be more like, hey, you know him, introduce me? Because that's what people do. That's what people did. That's not a new thing. It's kind of frowned upon now in the nepotism sense, but there's not really a nepotism angle. Cronyism a little bit in that regard, but there's a lot worse cronyism blatantly in the book that's, just purely intentionally there. So again, why this character is acting all moral high ground and such. Didn't really make a lot of sense to me per se, but then the character, I kind of kept waiting for a kind of a different resolution with that character, I guess, than these other two kind of having their own separate thing. And then the backlash being totally not what you expected it with regarding like 3 or 4 of these relationships. Again, not unsatisfying in the typical sense. So I guess if you want a predictable book, it's not a completely predictable book. So that's part of the reason why I don't want to go too much into detail if you haven't read it, because I don't want to spoil the stuff that's what you're not expecting. But what you're not expecting isn't necessarily as satisfying as what you might have been expecting, because that's what you expected, maybe. I don't know how to, Does that make sense? I don't know. I'm just kind of babbling a little bit more than I thought I guess I would, but it is so much to discuss, though. I mean, we're literally talking about 700 pages. And again, I'm not the expert on architecture or the history of the period in Manhattan and that kind of thing, as much as I would maybe want to be. And we, again, don't really delve into politics and history in the places where I am familiar in the ways that I thought we would. We kind of skirt over the stuff that, I've always heard that this was a really controversial author. And I was like, where's the controversy part? There's a whole bunch that's super maybe relevant to today, where there's a whole bunch of stuff I could say, well, yeah, Fox News could just read this on the air, and the other channel could just read this on the air, and whoever wins, I guess. But it's not like a knockdown, drag out political treatise or political fight as such. Even the characters who are fighting politically aren't really fighting over politics per se as much as personal ambition. So again, that's kind of where I would make the tie-in with this. Is it's kind of, where is your moral compass, yada yada yada, that kind of thing, which is kind of a nice tidy way to have a finishing point, I guess, that's as good as anything. And the love interest motivation, I wouldn't say it's like all over the place, because she doesn't really have like a character arc in any typical sense. She's definitely the same person pretty much the whole way through. And so she motivates things to a degree, but again, not necessarily in the way that you would expect. So it's kind of hard to even comment on that in the usual ways that I would. It's kind of like, well, she becomes super important here and here, but then here and here, it's kind of like, take a back seat and just keep your mouth shut. And what, not to be stereotypical, but what woman would talk so little about her actual desires and things to so few people? It's like, if you really, really, really love someone, I don't know how many other guys you're going to marry first. Spoiler alert, sorry, but especially not that guy that you had no interest in whatsoever, who was about to marry somebody else in the first place. Like, again, like, yeah, there were some parts where I was kind of like, for the sake of the story, sure, but would a modern editor sign off on those kind of choices? I'd have a harder time believing that they wouldn't expect some serious modifications to some of these relationships or whatever. Even like set when it is, it's kind of like, they're society people, and so it does, touch on how everything they do is kind of scrutinized, but the scrutiny doesn't like affect them in any kind of significant way, except for like when the one guy can't get a job, it's kind of like, okay, and then the other guy almost, and then the other guy, kind of the same thing. Again, but then, like I said, toward the end, we've gotten to the point where I see what you're trying to do, but I don't necessarily know if I believe it or agree with it in this way. Like, I don't know. You'll have to reach your own conclusion on that one. Like I said, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds and all of that and feel like I gave away some big secret or whatever. Again, like I had said in a previous video, when I was younger, everything was a spoiler. A kid came up to you on the playground and just told you the whole movie, and you decided based on what he said if you really, really wanted to see it in the theater, or you'd wait for it to come on TV or whatever. Like, oh, that was the movie he was talking about. Okay, and you sit through it, and it's more or less how he rambled it out, or better or worse. Whereas if he had really hyped it to you, like, yeah, it better be good, buddy, because you told me to see this movie. I paid to see this movie, because you said Ferris Bueller was awesome, or you said Rambo was awesome, or you said, whatever, that kind of thing. So yeah, again, if you're not really interested in politics, it's got some of that. If you're not really interested in, I don't know, allegory. I meant to say allegories and metaphors and all those kind of big words, and then I sort of forgot. In the babble, if you're not really, if you really, really have delicate sensibilities and, certain situations trigger you, then, avoid all literature, I guess. But again, apart from the first like 6 pages, I wouldn't consider it academia, but it's definitely not a romance novel. It's definitely not a whodunit per se, although, like I said, there's kind of legal battles and that kind of junk, but it's not presented in a real, gang, what's that show? The Law and Order. It's not a Law and Order kind of story. It's not Grisham or one of those kind of, if you aspire to be a lawyer, I don't think you're going to get much out of this book in terms of actual legal strategy. I would say do the opposite of anything in this book in a modern court case. Even divorce court. I don't think divorce court is going to go your way if you follow this instructions either. It's like the quickest, cleanest literary divorce of all time. At least one of them. The second one was almost messier, sort of, because the characters were better friends than the other ones or whatever. Who would have never been married in real life in the first place anyway. Like I said. Okay, so anyway, so that's that. As always, if you have any questions, please put them in the comments. I'll try and remember 900 pages worth of stuff and give you a good answer. And like I said, 2 books that are kind of disparate, but kind of joined in a philosophical or whatever sense, moralistic and allegorical or whatever. I'm sorry about the blurry background. I keep trying to get it to not do that so much, but my face hasn't been too much out of focus. Anyway. All right, so that's my ramble for, it's already after midnight, so now a Tuesday morning.